we're in something of a real difficulty with our education. And I think it's unsustainable. If you go to the schools, good teachers are leaving the school system in droves. Angry, burnt out. Young people are being bullied to death in the playground or by social media. Something is very wrong. And yet, if you can read this sign, you can thank a teacher. That one skill has opened the world to you. And thereafter, you're pretty much possibly on your own. And I'm speaking mostly about the systems of education we have. There are also homeschooling, which is good. There are hedge schools, a kind of a word for schools that take place where countries are under occupation. That's the pattern of history. And there's also cave schools. If you've ever been to an Aboriginal site and seen little handprints of obviously children on the walls, that's obviously a place of education. All those systems have worked well, but it's not the one I'm speaking to today. I was told that the story of education was from 18th century Gloucestershire, and an evangelical Christian by the name of Robert Raikes started Sunday schools for the chimney sweeps, and out of that comes the education system. Have any of you heard that? Yeah, well, it's not true. It's much better than that. It is a much better story than that. See, way back, when the Greeks and the Romans taught boys of the aristocracy how to become aristocracy and run the country, the churches were having classes, baptismal classes predominantly, and then classes for those who would become the leaders of the churches. But through the centuries, Mangalwadi says of India, for instance, pre-British education, by British he actually means the missionaries, was Muslim and Hindu elite and theology only. Quote, at the confluence of the holy rivers, Ganges, Yamuna and the mythical Sarawati, Allahabad is revered as one of India's holiest places. Islamic and Buddhist centres of civilization and pilgrimage. The money pilgrims donated is incalculable, yet the Hindu, Buddhist and Muslim civilizations did not establish a single significant institution of learning in the centre of Gangetic civilization. He makes the point often in his book that that good things often accumulate only to the nobility or the powerful or their favourites. But something happened in Christianity which was different from the norm. Borromeo was a cardinal of the Counter-Reformation. And there are two streams in the Counter-Reformation of the late 16th century. Borromeo saw that a lot of the problems of the church and the corruptions in it was because the clergy didn't even know what they were supposed to be teaching. They didn't know their own customs, they didn't know their own doctrines. So out of their lack of education, he started setting up systems of schools, firstly for the priesthood, but then the universities that emerged at that point. But he also set up Sunday schools for teaching the faith to people on Sundays at church. Borromeo is the guy that pretty much invented Sunday schools. And the Protestants later pinched the idea. And Martin Luther, basically, had decided to set up a whole system of public schools during the Reformation. Now, Luther couldn't do it quite, but he wanted a systematic education for boys and girls of all social classes throughout the areas. It was a radical idea. Like the church, he's in a church that's struggling to survive. And he says, what we want to do is invest in our young people. So we had primary schools going in the vernacular, whatever was the local language, and then if you went to high school, you learnt Latin and did things for leadership training. And there's this guy, Bugenhagen, with an interesting black hat. He was the man that carried it out. And through northern Germany and Scandinavia, they established public schools 200 years before English public schools, and that story of Robert Raikes that I mentioned. the same time that Bugenhagen was doing this, there's this guy that I think is a genius, the genius Comenius. He was a Moravian Christian. Few men have had greater influence than Comenius. He introduced pictorial textbooks, for which I'm very grateful. He had graduated learning, that is, you go from simple concepts to complex ones. Now, that might seem obvious to you and I, because we're come after him. But back then it was, well, look, here is the text, just read it. Memorise it. Learn it. Like the body of received wisdom that just gets dumped on you. That wasn't what we'd call education, but that's what was often the case. Equal opportunity to impoverished children and women made instruction universal and practical. What an incredible legacy from this Christian man. No one who knows the history of Comenius is in any doubt that this is a Christ-inspired movement. Further in the Christ-inspired movements around, soon after this, is Father Charles Michel de l'Épée started a school for the deaf because he wanted to share the gospel with them and wanted them then to be participants in sharing it with others. So he invented a kind of sign language. It's not the same one we have now, but he started it off. And Braille got those, the 6 dots you see everywhere now, to start a school for the blind. And he was in no doubt that it was a divine calling. And he lay on his deathbed, he said, quote, "I'm convinced that my mission is finished on earth. I tasted yesterday the delight. God condescended to brighten my eyes with the splendour of eternal hope." That inspiring Christian faith. But in Britain of the 18th century, at St John the Baptist, and in that congregation was an Anglican layman named Robert Raikes, who was a publisher and a businessman. Raikes was quite distressed about what was happening under child labour laws. And at that time, children worked in farm or in cities 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, but they got Sundays off. So Raikes thought this Sunday school thing, where you teach some people some stuff, is the key to unlocking the potential of all of these young people. They rented a kitchen in the home of Mrs. Meredith in 1780, initially teaching boys chimney sweeps, and then later girls. The older boys coached the younger boys. They had to come along looking neat and clean, and then sometimes they were given clothes so they could sit there decently. Mrs. Meredith found it hard going. She quit within 2 years. Not the last teacher to burn out. It wasn't long before one of the people who used to employ some of these children said, "The change could not have been more extraordinary, in my opinion, had they been transformed from the shape of wolves and tigers to that of men. The crime rate dropped sharply in Gloucestershire after the establishment of schools." A Christian commitment to public education could not be overstated. It wasn't just the Christians. There were others involved. But somebody had the courage and the compassion and the common good in their heart to take the risk. Let's talk about universities. Again, it's often said that the first university is Bologna in 1088. That's not true either. What I mean by university is not just a higher education thing, because there's always been those. For instance, they would teach the nobility to be the governors, so they would have a law and military academy type courses. People have had those all across the world. But what we're looking for is something international, something of high tertiary standard, where people are examined that they've reached the standard required. We would call it the granting of a decree or a certificate. But university is international by definition. The first one is in Persia, the Academy of Gundishpar. This is around the year 500. They had a library of about 400,000 books. The hospital there was the first medical centre in the 6th and 7th centuries, and they got distinguished scientists from Greece, Egypt, India and Rome. But it wasn't long before they built an observatory and taught astronomy, and the other sciences like maths that went with it, and with medicine, anatomy and dentistry. And then philosophy, they had a military academy, architecture, craftsmanship, agriculture, irrigation, geometry. 5,000 students were studying at Gundishbar. 500 scholars in different scientific fields teaching in Greek and Syriac. Hang on, Greek. Now what does Greek remind me of? Why in Persia are they teaching in Greek? Because that's how Gundishbar started. The Christians from the Christian Empire, which was Greek-speaking, went east and worked with the pagan philosophers, they call, or the Greek philosophers, in this first international, interfaith, tertiary, multidisciplinary, degree-awarding centre of excellence. It was the Nestorian Christians who first started Gundishbar and then welcomed all the other people from here, there and everywhere, and then it gradually expanded from there. Something about the respect for culture leads to teaching with the vernacular and the rise of that culture. Christians have done this for centuries. I love these guys, Cyril and Methodius, headed north from Greece into the wild and treacherous lands of the Slavic races we would call Russia. Dangerous undertaking. Methodius died before very long, and his brother Cyril continued on. And he respected their culture, though coming from a Greek background, you might have thought he might have despised it. Barbarians. He didn't. He respected their culture and their language, and so he took a script and he gave them a script where they could write their language. And that script is called Cyrillic, thanks to Saint Cyril. You'll see it on the side of all the Russian airplanes, and that's the language that's spoken throughout Russia. It looks like a Greek alphabet a lot, and that's why, thanks to Saint Cyril, who respected a culture, wanted the gospel to go into that culture, but the side effects of taking the gospel forward was that the whole culture ignited, and all that fantastic Russian literature is the result. How it empowers people. Translation of the Bible into the vernacular. John Wycliffe in England did the same there, and as we heard, Huss had done it over in Europe. Translation of the Bible into English was an incredible undertaking of great courage. People died for it. And even today in Pitjantjatjara country in South Australia, they are immensely grateful for the work of Bible translation, for what it contributed to the strength of Pit culture. And that story can be repeated in many places. I've talked to them about this. Has Christianity made a contribution to education? Much in every way. What are the Christian principles of education that have driven this? Well, there's quite a few, and I can only therefore mention a couple of them. The first one, most important one, is that Jesus called disciples. You know, the word disciple actually simply means a student. So if you want to follow Jesus, you're going to become a disciple, as it says. You're volunteering for lifelong learning. And Jesus instructed his disciples how to teach others. It says of the apostles, they never stopped teaching. Paul writes to Timothy, choose some people who are good for teaching others and train them up. He called women as well as men, as this picture shows. Remember that story of Martha busy with the housework, but Mary sat and listened to Jesus, and Jesus commends her for doing that. Women as well as men were conspicuous in leadership in the early church and in being instructed. In their world, only the boys were taught, but in the Christian world, the girls were taught as well. This is the core idea. The second thing about this is that Jesus focused on children. He says that all disciples have to be like a child. He said that the child is the most important person within the Christian community, and woe on you if you cause one to stumble. You see plenty of that in the news. He also says you have to teach them at home and share that responsibility with gifted teachers. Teach them at home as you walk by the way. Teach the young at home. It also says that we must all be learners. Teach me, O Lord. Everyone's a learner. And if that's difficult, There's an intriguing verse in Romans 15. If you think you've learned a lot about the faith, this one's for you. Those who are strong should bear with those who are weak and not please themselves in order to build them up. So if you've been a disciple of Christ for some time, you've been learning things, it's not now for you to raise the standards of how we do church. It's now for you to elevate children and take the hard road, take the difficult part about that upon yourself. Does that make sense? So we're not creating terrific tower of church and children have to be somehow fed in at the bottom and go up the elevator. That's not how we do it. What we do is we start with the children and the young people and the newcomers and we say, how can we lift them up? And then that becomes the sum of the church. Two different, I suppose in education, student-centred learning as opposed to heritage-centred learning. Friends, we've been doing this kind of learning since the first church. When Jesus says, come be my disciples, it started then and it's continued in lots of forms. And we have made our gifts available. We have invested in education. We have invested in books. We have invested in schools across the world and universities. That's the story. I wish it was the only story. I've already indicated there are some corruptions, but there's some other ones I want to show you. Christian schools have often been punishing places, and I'm really sorry if you went through one like this. It doesn't bear any resemblance, does it, to what I just described as the way Jesus taught about children. Just punishing. This is how you must elevate yourself. I'm going to train you like an animal into it. Terrible. I wish all the church schools were on a different path now, the one that seems to follow what Jesus said about education and children, but that's simply not the case. I hear from many people who would say, I've had enough of that at school. I'm truly sorry. As a leader in the church, I really do try and do something about this. We're not the only organisation which has some problems. As I said before, at the very beginning, both at secondary and tertiary level, teachers are very angry and close to burnout. But the fact is that a lot of the young people are exhausted too. The sexualisation of our culture, I think, has exhausted young people. They're questions of identity and who likes them and who doesn't and what's that supposed to look like is exhausting. It is confusing. How on earth can you do high-powered secondary education when life is presenting an all completely different agenda that almost nobody addresses? And the commercial people who get money out of this prospect continue to brutalise children with the sexualisation of the media. The school doesn't want to talk about it, and the families have been persuaded that they can't talk about it. We are in deep trouble. There's a group in Western Australia, a former school chaplain called Choose Respect, which has changed the culture of quite a few schools. We know it can work. We know you can change this culture. But we need major inputs because we are in deep trouble. Friends, the question about Christians in schools is not a question about do we have a chaplain or not. The question is not about do we have scripture or not. They're both quite good. The question is, what is it? Have we recovered the view of human flourishing, to use the modern term, that Jesus had in mind when he said, I've come that you may have life in all its fullness. Hence, we became disciples who discipled others. Friends, we have a fantastic track record which is currently under threat, major threat. It's killing kids and driving the best teachers, the good teachers, to burnout. If you are still in school, I commend you. I admire you. If you're still teaching somewhere, please keep it up. And please, let's try and creatively to find our way to recover our contribution, recover our great contribution.